What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a morning show set expecting a normal interview, only to be met with disrespect, condescension, and a host who refuses to show even basic courtesy? In just 34 seconds, a television personality would destroy his own reputation, turning what should have been a friendly conversation into one of the most uncomfortable moments in live television history. This is the story of how a simple interview spiraled completely out of control. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studio. Cameras were being adjusted, makeup artists were touching up faces, and producers were running through their final checks. Samuel L. Jackson had arrived early, as he always did. Professional to his core, he greeted everyone he passed with a smile and a kind word. The crew loved working with him. He was known throughout the industry as someone who treated everyone with respect, from the director to the person bringing coffee. Michael Strahan, on the other hand, had strolled in barely 20 minutes before airtime. His attitude was different from the start. He brushed past assistants without acknowledgement, complained about the lighting, and snapped at a production assistant who offered him water. The tension backstage was palpable. Staff members exchanged worried glances. They had seen Strahan in moods before, but something about today felt worse. When Jackson was led to the set, he settled into his chair with ease, adjusting his microphone and making small talk with the camera operators. He was there to promote his latest film, a passion project he had spent years developing. He was excited to share the story behind it, to talk about the incredible cast and crew who had brought his vision to life. This was supposed to be fun. Strahan walked onto the set without even glancing at Jackson. No handshake, no greeting, nothing. He sat down, immediately pulled out his phone, and started scrolling through it while the final countdown began. Jackson raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had been in this business long enough to know that sometimes people had off days. He was willing to give grace. The cameras went live. Strahan barely looked up from his phone before launching into his introduction. His voice was flat, disinterested. He mispronounced the name of Jackson's film, not once, but twice. Jackson politely corrected him the first time, gently, with a smile. But Strahan just waved his hand dismissively and continued talking over him. "So, Sam," Strahan said, leaning back in his chair with an attitude that suggested he would rather be anywhere else. "Another movie. You make what, like 10 of these a year? Must be hard to keep track of them all." The comment hung in the air. It was not just dismissive, it was insulting. Jackson had carefully chosen every project he worked on. Each role meant something to him, but he kept his composure. "Actually," he replied calmly, "I'm very selective about the work I do. This particular film is something I developed over 5 years. It means a great deal to me." Strahan yawned, visibly yawned, on live television. Jackson paused, clearly taken aback. The crew behind the cameras froze. This was beyond unprofessional. This was deliberately rude. But Jackson, ever the professional, tried to move forward. He began talking about the film's themes, about the character he played, about the message he hoped audiences would take away from it. Strahan interrupted him mid-sentence. Yeah, that's great and all, but let's be real here. You've been playing the same tough guy character for, 30 years now? Don't you ever get bored of it?" Jackson's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed slightly. Anyone who knew him would recognize that look. He was reaching his limit. But still, he maintained his professionalism. "With all due respect, Michael, if you had actually watched my films, you would know that I've played a wide range of characters, from dramatic roles to comedies to—" Sure, Strahan cut him off again, this time actually rolling his eyes. "But come on, at the end of the day, you're just the guy who yells and looks tough, right? How hard can that be?" The studio went silent. The crew members looked at each other in shock. Producers were frantically whispering into their headsets. This was crossing every line. Jackson sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his face unreadable. But beneath that calm exterior, you could see the storm brewing. "How hard can it be?" Jackson repeated slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "Let me tell you something, Michael. Acting is a craft. It takes years of training, dedication, and respect for the art form. It's not something you just do because you're famous or because someone handed you a job." Strahan laughed. Actually laughed. It was a mocking sound that echoed through the studio. "Oh, come on, don't be so sensitive. I'm just having a little fun here. Can't you take a joke?" "A joke?" Jackson's voice rose slightly. "You've been disrespectful since the moment I sat down. You didn't greet me. You've mispronounced the name of my film multiple times. You've dismissed my work, interrupted me repeatedly, and now you're mocking my entire career on live television. Where exactly is the joke in that?" The air in the studio became thick with tension. Strahan's smile faded slightly, but his arrogance remained. "Look, man, if you can't handle a little criticism, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. This is how it works. I ask tough questions." "Tough questions?" Jackson's voice was sharp now. "You haven't asked me a single real question. You've been condescending and disrespectful. There's a difference between journalism and just being rude to someone for no reason. And frankly, I don't think you know the difference." Strahan leaned forward, his face hardening. "Excuse me? You don't get to come on my show and talk to me like that. Do you know who I am? I'm a Super Bowl champion. I've built an empire. What have you done besides read lines someone else wrote for you?" The insult was so absurd, so completely out of line, that for a moment, Jackson just stared at him. The crew looked horrified. One camera operator actually took a step back, as if physically recoiling from what had just been said. Jackson had won countless awards, had starred in some of the highest-grossing films of all time, had earned the respect of directors, actors, and audiences worldwide. And here was Strahan, reducing all of that to nothing. Jackson took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but there was steel in it. "What have I done? I've dedicated my life to my craft. I've worked with the greatest directors in the world. I've created characters that people remember, that mean something to them. I've earned every single thing I have through hard work and talent. And I have never, not once, treated another person the way you're treating me right now," Strahan scoffed. "Oh, please, you Hollywood types are all the same, so full of yourselves. You think you're special because you're in movies. Newsflash, you're not." "This has nothing to do with Hollywood," Jackson replied firmly. "This is about basic respect, something you clearly don't understand. I came here in good faith to have a conversation about my work. Instead, you've spent the entire time insulting me. And for what? To make yourself feel important? To prove something to your audience?" Strahan's face flushed red. "You know what? If you don't like how I run my show, there's the door. Nobody is forcing you to be here." Jackson stood up slowly, carefully removing his microphone. The gesture was deliberate, measured. He looked directly at Strahan, and when he spoke, every word carried weight. "You're absolutely right. Nobody is forcing me to be here. And I choose not to be somewhere where I'm not treated with respect. I've been in this industry for decades, and I've sat across from hundreds of interviewers. Some were brilliant, some were just okay. But every single one of them understood the basic principle of courtesy. You're the first person who's made me feel like walking out." Strahan stood up too, his voice rising. "Fine, walk out then, see if I care. You think you're irreplaceable? I can get 10 other actors in here tomorrow who would be grateful for the opportunity." Jackson placed his microphone on the chair with careful precision. "Maybe you can, but I guarantee they'll leave feeling just as disrespected as I do right now. Because this isn't about me, Michael. This is about how you treat people. And judging by the looks on your crew members' faces, I'm not the first person you've made feel this way." Several crew members looked down at the floor, confirming Jackson's observation without saying a word. Strahan noticed, and it only made him angrier. "Get out," he shouted. "Get out of my studio, right now." Jackson didn't rush. He didn't storm off in anger. Instead, he turned to the crew, to the camera operators and sound technicians and producers who had been watching this disaster unfold. "Thank you all for your professionalism," he said quietly. "You deserve better than this." Then he looked back at Strahan one last time. And so did I. He walked off the set with his head held high, his dignity intact. Behind him, Strahan was still yelling, but his words seemed empty now, hollow. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of the host's meltdown. Producers were scrambling, trying to cut to commercial, trying to salvage something from this disaster. As Jackson reached the edge of the set, one of the producers approached him, apologizing profusely. Jackson simply nodded, accepting the apology with grace. He understood that the crew were just doing their jobs, that they had no control over their host's behavior. He bore them no ill will. Back on set, Strahan was pacing, his face still red, his hands gesturing wildly as he ranted to no one in particular. "Can you believe that guy? The nerve. Walking out on me, on my show. Who does he think he is?" An assistant director tried to calm him down, suggesting they take a break, regroup, figure out how to proceed. But Strahan wasn't interested in regrouping. He was too caught up in his own anger, his own wounded pride. He couldn't see that he was the one who had been in the wrong, that his behavior had been the problem from the very beginning. In the hallway outside the studio, Jackson was gathered his things from his dressing room. His phone was already buzzing with messages from his team, from friends who had seen the live broadcast, from industry colleagues expressing their support. But Jackson wasn't focused on any of that. He was thinking about the young production assistants he had met that morning, about the crew members who had to work with Strahan every day, about the pattern of behavior that had clearly been going on long before he arrived. One of the camera operators caught up with him in the hallway. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, and she looked embarrassed. "Mr. Jackson," she said quietly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened in there. That was not okay." Jackson smiled at her, a genuine smile despite everything that had just happened. "You have nothing to apologize for. You did your job beautifully. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The camera operator's eyes welled up slightly. "He's like that with everyone," she admitted, "but nobody ever says anything. They just take it because it's a big show, and they don't want to cause problems." Jackson nodded, understanding. Sometimes someone has to say something. Sometimes you have to stand up, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Because if you don't, the behavior just continues. Back in the studio, the commercial break was ending. Strahan was being urged by his producers to address what had happened, to apologize, to salvage the situation, but his pride wouldn't let him. When the cameras came back on, he simply moved to the next segment, pretending as if nothing had occurred. He made a brief, dismissive comment about some guests not being able to handle a real conversation, and then launched into a cooking segment with forced enthusiasm. But the damage was done. The entire exchange had been broadcast live. People had seen it. They had watched a respected actor be treated with contempt. They had witnessed Strahan's arrogance, his dismissiveness, his complete lack of professionalism. And more importantly, they had seen Jackson's measured response, his attempts to remain professional in the face of disrespect, his decision to walk away rather than escalate further. The contrast could not have been more stark. On one side, a man who had built his career on talent and hard work, who treated everyone around him with respect, who maintained his dignity even in the face of insults. On the other side, a host who seemed to believe his position gave him the right to treat guests however he wanted, who prioritized his own ego over basic courtesy, who couldn't recognize his own failings. As Jackson left the building, he paused for a moment outside, taking a deep breath of fresh air. The morning sun was bright, the city was bustling around him, and he felt a strange sense of peace. He had done the right thing. He had stood up for himself and for the principle that everyone deserves respect, regardless of who they are or what they do. His driver approached, and they headed to the car. As they pulled away from the studio, Jackson looked back at the building one last time. He thought about the crew members still inside, still working under those conditions. He thought about future guests who might face the same treatment, and he hoped that by walking out, by refusing to accept that behavior, he had set an example. He hoped that others might feel empowered to do the same. Inside the studio, the show continued, but the energy was different. The crew worked mechanically, going through the motions. Strahan kept up his on-camera persona, but there was a tightness around his eyes, a tension in his shoulders. He knew something had shifted. He just didn't want to acknowledge it. The thing about live television is that you can't take anything back. You can't edit out the uncomfortable moments, can't pretend they didn't happen. Everything is captured, preserved, witnessed by thousands or even millions of people. And what those people had witnessed that morning was a masterclass in contrasts. They had seen professionalism versus arrogance, respect versus contempt, dignity versus ego. The moment when Jackson stood up and removed his microphone would be replayed countless times. That gesture, so simple yet so powerful, would become symbolic. It represented every person who had ever been treated poorly in a workplace, every individual who had faced disrespect from someone in a position of power, every moment when someone had to choose between accepting bad behavior or standing up for themselves. What made the entire situation even more striking was the pattern it revealed. This wasn't just one bad interview. This was evidence of a larger problem, a culture where someone's fame or position made them feel entitled to treat others poorly. And Jackson's response had pulled back the curtain on that culture, had shown everyone what was happening behind the scenes. The conversation that Strahan had claimed would be just having a little fun had turned into something much more significant. It had become a moment that made people think about how we treat each other, about what we accept as normal behavior, about the difference between confidence and arrogance, between strong questioning and simple rudeness. Throughout his entire career, Samuel L. Jackson had been known for his professionalism. Directors praised him, co-stars loved working with him, crew members spoke highly of him. He had built a reputation not just on his talent, but on how he conducted himself, on the respect he showed to everyone around him. That reputation had been earned over decades, through consistent behavior, through treating people well even when cameras weren't rolling. Strahan, in contrast, had shown a different side of himself that morning. He had revealed what happened when he felt he could say whatever he wanted without consequences. He had demonstrated what his version of asking tough questions really meant, and it wasn't pretty. It wasn't journalism. It wasn't even entertainment. It was just mean-spirited dismissiveness dressed up as boldness. The irony was thick. Strahan had accused Jackson of being sensitive, of not being able to take a joke, of being full of himself. But who was the one who had yelled? Who was the one who had lost his composure? Who was the one who had insulted someone's entire life's work? It wasn't Jackson. Jackson had remained calm, had articulated his concerns clearly, had made his point without resorting to shouting or name-calling. When the show finally wrapped that day, the building felt heavier. Crew members packed up equipment in near silence. The usual banter was absent. People moved quickly, efficiently, wanting to be done and gone. There would be meetings later, discussions about what happened, decisions to be made about how to handle the situation. But in that moment, everyone just wanted to leave. Strahan retreated to his dressing room, still convinced he had done nothing wrong, still believing that Jackson had been the problem. He scrolled through his phone, perhaps looking for validation, perhaps avoiding the reality of what had just occurred. His ego wouldn't allow him to see the truth, that he had been the antagonist in this story, that he had been the one who had crossed lines that should never be crossed, that he had treated a guest with such contempt that walking out was the only reasonable response. Meanwhile, Jackson was already back at his hotel, fielding calls from his team. They were discussing whether to make a public statement, whether to address what happened directly, or let the footage speak for itself. Jackson was inclined toward the latter. He felt the exchange spoke volumes on its own. Sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all, allowing people to draw their own conclusions from what they had witnessed. What had started as a simple promotional interview had transformed into something much larger. It had become a teaching moment about respect, about professionalism, about the importance of maintaining dignity even when others don't. It had shown that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in disrespect. That walking away isn't weakness, it's strength. The studio audience that had been present for the filming sat stunned throughout the entire exchange. Some had gasped at Strahan's comments. Others had looked uncomfortable, unsure whether this was part of some scripted bit or genuine conflict. When Jackson walked off, a few people had actually started to clap, catching themselves quickly, but not before the sound had echoed through the studio. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about where the audience's sympathies lay. That spontaneous applause, brief as it was, had captured something important. It showed that people recognized dignity when they saw it. They understood the difference between someone standing up for themselves and someone being difficult. They could see that Jackson had tried, repeatedly, to keep the interview on track, to give Strahan chances to reset, to maintain professionalism despite the provocation. The contrast between the two men had never been clearer. Jackson had decades of experience handling difficult interviews, aggressive questions, challenging situations. He knew how to navigate them with grace. But this hadn't been a difficult interview. It had been disrespectful from the start, and there's a world of difference between the two. A difficult interview challenges you with tough but fair questions. A disrespectful interview dismisses you, belittles you, treats you as less than. Strahan had confused the two, or perhaps he had simply stopped caring about the difference. His position, his fame, his success had apparently convinced him that he could say whatever he wanted, however he wanted, to whomever he wanted. He had forgotten that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn, and it's something you can lose very quickly through your actions. The exchange would be studied, analyzed, discussed at length. Media experts would weigh in. Public relations professionals would dissect every moment. But really, the lesson was simple. Treat people with respect. It doesn't matter who they are, what they do, how famous they are or aren't. Basic. Courtesy is not optional, it's fundamental. And when you fail to show it, when you deliberately choose to be disrespectful, you reveal far more about yourself than about the person you're disrespecting. Jackson had walked onto that set as a guest, ready to share his work and his passion. He had left as a symbol of dignity in the face of disrespect. He hadn't planned for that. He hadn't wanted that. But when faced with the choice between accepting poor treatment and standing up for himself, he had chosen the latter. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone watching that we all have that choice, every day, in every interaction. This was the story that unfolded that morning, not just of an interview gone wrong, but of a moment that crystallized something larger. A moment that showed the importance of respect, of professionalism, of maintaining your dignity even when others lose theirs. A moment that proved that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply to walk away, to refuse to participate in disrespect, to demonstrate through your actions what you believe about how people should treat each other. And 34 seconds was all it took for everything to fall apart, for a host to reveal his true colors, and for a guest to show what real class looks